The Lake House Nightmare. The allure of a secluded lakefront getaway for Memorial Day weekend was impossible to resist. 6 of us, Jamie, Crystal, Rich, Adam, C, and myself, piled into Adam's truck, our spirits high as we left the familiar comforts of home behind. Little did we know that our idyllic retreat would soon become a terrifying fight for survival. The Airbnb listing had seemed perfect. A spacious house with a wraparound deck, hot tub, and fire pit overlooking a pristine lake. Best of all, it was miles from the nearest neighbor, promising complete privacy for our raucous celebration. As we pulled up the long, winding gravel driveway, the house emerged from the dense forest like something out of a dream. We wasted no time settling in, cracking open beers and cranking up the music as the sun began its lazy descent towards the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue and the sound of laughter. In those first golden hours, it felt like we had found our own private paradise. As twilight deepened into true darkness, we gathered around the fire pit, our inhibitions loosened by alcohol and the intoxicating sense of freedom that comes with being young and far from home. The flames cast dancing shadows across our faces as we shared stories and dreams, blissfully unaware of the malevolent forces gathering in the surrounding woods. The first sign that something was amiss came in the form of a harsh voice cutting through a revelry. We all jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a middle-aged woman with unkempt hair and wild eyes. She railed against us, out-of-towners, accusing us of littering and disturbing the peace. There was something off about her, beyond the typical frustration of an angry neighbor. Her eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity in the firelight, and her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like. When she abruptly turned and vanished into the pitch-black forest, we all felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. We tried to shake off the encounter with nervous laughter, but an undercurrent of unease had crept into our celebration. The music seemed a little too loud now, our voices a little too shrill as we tried to recapture the carefree mood of earlier. It was in one of those brief moments of silence between songs that we heard it, a faint cry for help coming from the direction of the lake. We exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if our minds were playing tricks on us. But then it came again, clearer this time. Help! I'm in the water. Adrenaline surged through us as Adam and I sprang into action, grabbing a kayak and paddles. The others called encouragement from the shore as we launched into the inky blackness of the lake. We shouted periodically, trying to locate the source of the cries, but something strange was happening. No matter how far we paddled, the voice seemed to be receding, always just beyond our reach. After what felt like an eternity of fruitless searching, an even more chilling sound reached our ears, screams of terror coming from the direction of the house. Female screams. Our friends. We paddled back with desperate speed, our minds racing with horrific possibilities. As we neared the shore, an eerie silence had fallen over the property. No music, no laughter, no screams. Just the lapping of water against the kayak and our own ragged breathing. Calling out for our friends yielded no response. The house stood dark and silent, the fire pit nothing but glowing embers. It was as if our companions had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only half-empty beer bottles and still warm chairs as evidence they had ever been there at all. Panic rising in our throats, Adam and I jumped into his truck and tore up the road, searching for any sign of civilization. We finally came upon another house, its windows glowing with warm light. But as we approached, that feeling of wrongness intensified. Peering through the front window, we saw her, the same disheveled woman who had accosted us earlier. She stood motionless in the center of the room, staring directly at us with that same unnerving intensity. No matter how we shouted or pounded on the door, she remained as still as a statue, her eyes boring into us with inhuman malice. Just as we were about to flee, my phone vibrated, a miracle given the spotty service. It was Rich, his voice tight with fear as he described 2 masked men wielding axes emerging from the woods. They had barely escaped, he said, and were now hiding in the forest by the road. Relief at hearing from our friends was short-lived, as the call abruptly cut off. We waited in agonizing suspense until finally, mercifully, we saw the flashing lights of police cars in the distance. What followed was a blur of confusion and terror. Our friends were found, shaken but unharmed. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and extensive searches of the lake and surrounding woods turned up nothing. The police were skeptical of our tale, clearly suspecting that drugs or alcohol had fueled mass hysteria. But we knew what we had experienced. The crying voice in the lake that led us away from our friends. The axe-wielding figures materializing from the darkness. And that woman, if she could be called that, with her unblinking stare and unnatural stillness. In the harsh light of day, it was easy to doubt ourselves. Perhaps it had all been an elaborate prank, or some strange shared delusion brought on by too much alcohol and an unfamiliar environment. But in the quiet moments, when sleep proves elusive and shadows seem to move of their own accord, we remember the truth of that night. Something evil lurks in those woods, something that toys with human prey for its own inscrutable purposes. It may wear the faces of those we think we know, may lure us with cries for help or strike from the shadows. But its true nature is beyond our comprehension, as vast and dark as the lake that nearly became our watery grave. We left that place behind, but the memories haunt us still. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear a faint voice calling for help, always just beyond reach, tempting me back to that nightmare by the lake. The boat trip from hell. The warm breeze carried the promise of summer as we set out on Memorial Day weekend, ready to celebrate our newfound freedom after months of pandemic-induced isolation. Our friend Jacob, born into wealth and privilege, had invited us to join him on his father's luxurious boat for a day of sun, drinks, and revelry out on the bay. Tony, Mikey, and I met at Jacob's waterfront mansion, our spirits high as we boarded the gleaming vessel. Little did we know that this day of carefree indulgence would spiral into a night of terror that would haunt us for years to come. The bay was alive with activity, dozens of boats gathered in the shallows for an impromptu floating party. We tied up alongside the others, hopping from deck to deck with drinks in hand, basking in the joyous atmosphere. The alcohol flowed freely, and as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we found ourselves pleasantly buzzed and feeling invincible. It wasn't until the other boats began to disperse that we realized just how intoxicated Jacob had become. He swayed unsteadily at the helm, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Concern pierced through our alcohol-induced haze. We were miles from shore with no sober captain to guide us home. We convinced Jacob to sleep it off in the cabin, hoping a few hours of rest would return him to a state fit for navigating. As darkness fell, an unsettling quiet descended over the bay. The distant lights of the shoreline seemed to waver and distort, as if we were looking at them through a veil of water. When Jacob finally emerged from the cabin, he seemed more coherent, if still far from sober. With no other options, we began the slow journey back towards his canal. That's when we noticed the other boat. It appeared as nothing more than a dark shape at first, keeping pace with us at a distance. But as we drew closer to the mouth of the canal, it became clear that the mysterious vessel was following us with deliberate intent. Panic began to set in. Jacob's erratic driving became more pronounced as he fixated on the possibility of it being the water police. We scrambled to hide evidence of our drinking, concocting flimsy alibis in hushed, frantic whispers. The canal stretched before us like a black ribbon, the narrow passage hemmed in by looming trees and darkened houses. Our pursuer drew ever closer, the low thrum of its engine a constant reminder of the threat at our backs. As we finally approached Jacob's dock, the other boat pulled alongside us. Relief washed over us as we realized it wasn't the authorities, but that relief quickly curdled into a new kind of fear. 3 men stood at the stern, their faces hidden in shadow, radiating a palpable aura of menace. Jacob, his judgment clouded by alcohol and fear, shouted a challenge at the strangers. They remained silent, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent in the dim light. As they continued past us, a sick feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. This encounter was far from over. Sure enough, the boat reappeared less than 10 minutes later as we lounged by Jacob's pool, still trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. The men's gazes locked onto us with laser focus as they cruised by, leaving no doubt that we were the object of their twisted interest. The night became a haze after that, alcohol and exhaustion blurring the edges of reality. I awoke in the dark hours before dawn, my mouth dry as sandpaper and my head pounding. As I stumbled to the kitchen for water, the nightmare truly began. A figure materialized from the shadows, a man dressed all in black, his face obscured by a ski mask. The barrel of a gun glinted in the faint light, aimed squarely at my chest. My blood turned to ice as he demanded in a harsh whisper to know the location of the house's owner. Trembling, I led him and a second masked intruder up to Jacob's room. What followed was a terrifying ordeal as they forced Jacob to call his father and obtain the combination to the family safe. I watched, helpless, as they emptied its contents into a bag, cash, jewelry, important documents, all disappearing into the night. In the aftermath, as police combed the property for evidence, the full horror of our situation became clear. Those men on the boat had followed us home, marking Jacob's house as a target based on the obvious signs of wealth. Our drunken revelry had made us easy prey, oblivious to the danger until it was too late. The physical items stolen that night were insignificant compared to the sense of safety and security that was ripped away from us. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow in the corner of my eye, now carries the potential for unspeakable threat. I find myself unable to enjoy boats or bodies of water anymore, always scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. And in my darkest moments, I wonder, what if those men had decided that witnesses were too great a liability? How close did we come to simply disappearing that night? Our fates as murky and impenetrable as the depths of the bay. As another Memorial Day approaches, I can't help but reflect on how quickly celebration can turn to terror, how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. So if you find yourself out on the water this holiday weekend, remember, not all who sail the night seas have innocent intentions. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't hiding in the depths below, but walking among us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.